Among the extensive and widespread sand dunes found all along the Indian Ocean coast of Western Australia are many which are interpreted as tsunami deposits. Typically, these tsunami deposited dunes comprise coarse sand grains with shell fragments, rocks and boulders, and which form into longitudinal ridges which come to a point in the direction of wave travel known as tsunami chevrons. In contrast, other people suggest these dunes are similar to wind-blown dunes found in places like North America and Western Europe. And yet, for sand dunes to form by wind action alone, a different set of conditions are required than those currently found in Western Australia. So the question arises, where and how do wind-blown sand dunes form? It might sound obvious, but wind-blown sand dunes need an abundance of sand and a steady wind to blow it. Western Australia definitely has the strong, steady wind systems that can build dunes, but what about an abundance of sand? To answer these questions, first we need to ask something even more fundamental. Where does sand originate?
So this is Cottesloe Beach near Perth in Western Australia, and Cottesloe is typical of just about every one of the beaches along the Indian Ocean coastline of Australia. It's narrow, just a few metres wide, and it's comprised of this really fine grained and light coloured quartz sand. Now quartz sand is the same type of sand that's found on beaches all over the planet. And also along this coastline the sand also forms into huge dune systems that can be many metres high and can go for many kilometres inland. But a question is, where does this sand come from? How did this sand get here? Now, an obvious answer might be that the sand was washed in from the sea, which, yes it was. All of the sand along this coastline is definitely marine in origin. It was washed in from the sea. However, it didn't originate there. Sand actually comes from somewhere you might not imagine.
Sand actually comes from places like this. This is Wastwater in Cumbria in the northwest of England, and this region is called the Lake District due to the number of lakes in the area. Now Wastwater is actually England's deepest lake, and just behind me, although you can't see it because of the typical Cumbrian weather, is England's highest mountain, which is called Scafell Pike. Now, as you can see from, this is a really illustrative rock face. This is called the Screes, and it's so obvious that this is an erosional site, and the rocks are being eroded and deposited into the lake itself. And this is also the place where sand originates. All sand on every beach everywhere on the planet originally comes from locations like this. And places such as here, which is the summit of Snowdon, which is the high point in England and Wales, but you'll just have to take my word for it today that this is the summit, because there's not much of a view.
Western Australia does have many very ancient mountains, including the Hamersley Range in the Pilbara to the north, and the Stirling Range to the south, including Bluff Knoll. But the vast expanse of Western Australia, including the wheat belt and the goldfields, is an almost featureless, unending plain. When we say ancient, there has not been a mountain building event in this region for well over 1 billion years. Without new mountains, there is little or no new sand.
Cumbria is also a really interesting place from a geology point of view. There are literally every different type of rock in the surrounding areas from here. There are sedimentary, igneous and metamorphic rocks. But the rock type which I'll use for illustration is granite. Granite is almost ubiquitous. It's found everywhere all around the planet, and it's always made from the same three minerals: quartz, feldspar and mica. Now the quartz is the part that makes up the sand that is found on our beaches.
In common with many other parts of the world, granite also underlies much of Western Australia, such as here at Contos Beach in the Cape to Cape region.
Yes, this is a typical day in Cumbria in the middle of summer. The sand is weathered out of the rocks, eroded and transported downstream.
Small streams join together and form larger river channels, which transport even more sediment. Note the amount of rainfall needed for rivers to transport sediment out from the mountains. The mountains themselves generate even more rainfall due to how they interact with the air masses flowing over them. Compare this with Western Australia. With much drier conditions, no mountains to generate additional rainfall, there are very few rivers. But rivers that are, have so little flow that some of them, for most of the year, do not even reach the sea. A good example of this is the Moor River at Gilderton. A combination of low rainfall, seepage into the underlying bedrock, and high evaporation creates a sandbar over the river mouth for approximately 10 months of the year. Western Australia also contains traces of several great rivers which flowed across the plains some tens of millions of years ago. A combination of drying climate as Australia continues to move north due to continental drift, and a series of tectonic uplifts of the southern region of West Australia some 5 million years ago have dried out these channels, leaving today's salt encrusted remnants. Compare this to a typical European river.
Once the rivers leave the mountains, they enter a quieter phase where, rather than the principal factors being erosion and transportation, we still get transportation, but we start to get deposition. And in such places as this is Style in Cheshire in the northwest of England, and I'm at the confluence of two of the tributaries of the River Mersey. We have the River Bollen from that side and the River Dean from that side, and the river continues downstream as the River Bollen from this point, eventually joining the Mersey several kilometres in that direction. Now, this whole area is the Cheshire floodplain, and every time there is a flood, there is a huge amount of extra transportation of sediment, but also the sediment is deposited all across this area. This is one of the reasons why the Cheshire Plain is so fertile and good as farmland. So just how much sediment do the rivers carry? This is the estuary of the River Mersey at Liverpool. And as you can see, the water it looks like a dirty brown colour. It's not pollution, this is actually the sediment that has been washed down from the mountains and the hills in North Wales and in the Pennines in northern England and Cheshire. And all of the sediment is washed down and washed into this part of the river.
We can see how much sediment load is carried by this region's rivers by looking at the coastal wetlands and how they continue to change and grow in extent due to sediment deposition. This is the River Dee at Parkgate on the Wirral. The boathouse, built in the year 1850, is now around 1.5 kilometres from the water's edge.
So today I'm at Calaverick Castle in the southwest of Scotland in Dumfriesshire. This castle was built in the 13th century, and in common with just about every other castle in the British Isles, the castle itself was built right on the edge of the water. In the intervening 800 or so years since the castle was built, the water has now retreated due to the deposition of the sediment by about a kilometre. In fact, this castle is also built near the remains of some Roman structures, including a Roman dock that is now about 1.2 kilometres away from the water's edge. This is actually the only river in the region from southern Scotland through northwest England and onto North Wales that is still actually navigable by big ships. We can't see it today, but this part of the river is constantly dredged, and the sediment that is deposited along the river is dredged and is deposited far out to sea.
In comparison, This is the port of Fremantle on the Swan River, the biggest river in Western Australia. The water is clear and just about free of sediment. A time lapse of the Collie River at Australind near Bunbury in Western Australia shows almost no change over 40 years. There is simply no new sand being deposited along the Indian Ocean coast of Australia. By comparison, this is Rhyl in North Wales. When I first visited Rhyl as a child in the 1970s, the sea wall ran along the edge of the coastal road. In the intervening 50 years or so, the sea wall has moved the beach back over 100 metres, showing that sediment deposition is changing the landscape on a scale visible in a single human lifetime. Another major event in the recent geological past released a huge amount of additional sand, silt and sediment into the environment in one go.
Wastwater in Cumbria in northwest England is a typical glacial landscape. The glacier formed just a few kilometres to the north and it flowed along this valley, scouring out Wastwater itself. This is actually England's deepest lake and the glacier is responsible for creating this lake. The glacier scoured all the way along the valley and continued to travel to the south. The glacier is also responsible for carrying huge amounts of sediment with it. It will grind down the rock into what's known as a rock flour, which is just the constituent quartz and silt and things, but it also will sometimes carry along with it small rocks and sometimes huge rocks, which when a huge rock is deposited somewhere outside the glacial area, it's known as an erratic.
Glaciers are able to transport huge amounts of sediment, sometimes hundreds of kilometres.
To places such as this. This is Thurston in the Wirral in the northwest of England, and behind me are some cliffs that are formed from a type of soil called boulder clay. Boulder clay is actually a glacial deposit, and in this case what's happened is the glacier has flowed from the north from as far away as Cumbria, that's like around about 100 kilometres or more away, and this is the place where the glacier ended. This is the glacial snout. At some point as the glacier starts to retreat, all of the soil, the rocks and the sand and the silt was actually deposited to form these cliffs, so this is what we would call a terminal moraine. Now, these cliffs, as you can see, are actively eroding, and the soil and the sand and all the other debris is constantly being eroded and deposited on the beach.
Contrast this with Western Australia, which has seen no glaciation in over 100 million years.
Eventually, the sand that was weathered from the rocks in the mountains eroded and transported downstream by the rivers and then deposited in the sea ends up in a place like this. This is Formby Beach in the northwest of England. Unfortunately right now the tide is in so that you cannot see actually the full width of the beach, but at low tide it's around 1 kilometre wide. This is an important part of the story of how wind-blown sand dunes actually form.
Tides are the next prerequisite for the formation of wind-blown sand dunes.
The river is also tidal with extremely strong currents that flow in and out of the estuary twice per day. At this point here, the tidal range is actually 9 metres.
A high tidal range means the sea retreats twice per day, uncovering extensive wide beaches, and crucially allows the sand to dry out, which in turn permits wind transportation of fine sand particles. Wind-blown dunes form above the high water mark in locations where blowing sand has encountered some type of an obstacle, such as vegetation or driftwood, for example. The dunes grow and evolve as the fine sand particles accumulate and migrate over time. Abundant sand without a high tidal range means the sand does not get exposed, cannot dry out, and can never be transported in quantities enough to create wind-blown dunes. The coast of Western Australia, as shown by the narrow and unchanging beaches, has a tidal range of almost zero. If we take away any of the required elements, mountains, precipitation, tides, or high winds, then wind-blown sand dunes cannot form. And the sand dunes here, along the Indian Ocean coast, are different from the dunes in other parts of the world. Whilst there is an element of wind action found in the shaping of these dunes, the sand itself was not deposited here by wind action. The coarse sand, containing numerous rocks and boulders, was deposited in these locations by tsunamis. In the next episode, we travel a 600km stretch of coast from Cape Leeuwin in the south to Dongara 300km to the north of Perth, and we find chevron dunes in the process of formation. Stay tuned!